The memorandum of understanding was never going to work. I never really thought it had a chance, and there's nobody honestly knows if the son is alive or if he's conscious most of the day or what his situation is. He's not been seen in public. Confusing what Trump's objectives are. Trump is in a problem of his own making. This is the trap that Trump is in, and he doesn't know how to get out of it. And he reacts to what he's seeing on television or hearing on the radio. Well, he's never been much of a supporter of NATO. He came very close actually to withdrawing at the 2018 NATO summit.
US-Iran war is entering a critical phase, and joining me now is a man who knows Mr. Trump and who's been inside the White House and knows the Iran policy much better than anyone else. So, Mr. Bolton, first of all, welcome to Times Network.
Glad to be with you.
Lovely to have you, Mr. Bolton. You know how the situation has changed suddenly. US is bombing, Iran is bombing. First of all, what are your thoughts on the current situation?
Well, I think that the memorandum of understanding was never going to work. I never really thought it had a chance. And there's one critical reason for it. It has many defects, but one critical reason is that the political leaders and diplomats with whom the U.S. was negotiating don't have control over the Revolutionary Guard. The fact is that the U.S. and Israeli strikes back in February and March and April really decimated the regime at the top levels. Obviously, the supreme leader died and had to be replaced by his son. Nobody honestly knows if the son is alive or if he's conscious most of the day or what his situation is. He's not been seen in public since he was made supreme leader. But it seems to me the only rational explanation for Iran's contradictory behavior is the Revolutionary Guard does what it wants to do. If it wants to close the Strait of Hormuz, if it wants to attack commercial traffic in the Gulf, it's going to do it regardless of what the political officials are saying publicly or negotiating. So, in effect, the U.S. negotiated with the wrong people because the civilian officials simply don't have control over the people who have the weapons.
Like you said, the regime is gone, the Khamenei is gone, the son is there or not there. Nobody really knows. But you worked with Mr. Trump very closely, in the first term. What's the man like, and what's the actual strategy here? Is there actual strategy, or US is improvising it with each passing day?
Well, I think improvising with each passing day is most likely to be the case. The attacks themselves, beginning on February 28th, initially seemed to be an effort at regime change, which I've supported for 20 years. But it's became clear as time goes on that the necessary preparations beyond the military strikes had not been made. And so it's still, to this day, confusing what Trump's objectives are. And I think when he agreed to the ceasefire and then the memorandum of understanding, his focus was not on strategy in the Gulf. It was on getting the price of gasoline down in America for the American consumer.
What is it going to take, for US to, stop the war,
Trump is in a problem of his own making. Because his war aims were not clear, and because he either didn't realize or didn't take into account the potential effect that the war would have on global energy prices and therefore on, as we call it, the price at the pump for gasoline for American consumers. And that put him in a real dilemma because the military capabilities of Iran, while badly damaged, were not totally obliterated. And that meant that the regime had the opportunity, which it took, to close the Strait of Hormuz. That's another unanswered question, why he didn't prepare for it in advance. It was well known, we talked about it back in his first term, that one Iranian response to a regime change effort would be to do exactly what has happened, close the Strait of Hormuz. And yet Trump seems surprised by that. These are examples of how he's not thinking the issue through. He's just making decisions one at a time.
Trump has now announced that there's going to be a 20% tariff on the ships they'll pass from the Hormuz. If those things don't take place, do you feel that US military is capable of an on ground activity and taking over the entire regime there?
Trump has been pretty clear he doesn't want to see American boots on the ground. That may not apply to relatively small elements of special forces
Mm-hmm.
or units that are used for the purpose of destroying anti-missile
Mm-hmm.
batteries, radars,
Mm-hmm.
strike places from drones or fast boats. I think in terms of a larger force on the ground, I don't see that happening. I
Mm-hmm.
do think that we can defend commercial traffic in the Gulf and through the Strait with some confidence, but it is going to take military force. This is a real problem for Trump. Our June inflation figures just came out, and they showed a drop of inflation because gasoline prices had dropped as predicted. Well, today they're going back up again because the
Yeah.
war has broken down. This is the trap that Trump is in, and he doesn't know how to get out of it.
Mr. Bolton, in one of your recent interactions with a news outlet, you described Mr. Trump as a man who works on impulse and flattery in television. How he captionizes those text messages on the Twitter and So give us a bit more about that. When you were working there, how was it, and how does the man really functions?
Well, he watches Fox News a lot and other TV news channels in the United States, and he reacts to what he's seeing on television or hearing on the radio, and often makes decisions without consulting with his advisors. In the first term, we tried to try and keep the train moving on the tracks, but in the second term, he's really surrounded himself with yes men and yes women who don't say, "But Mr. President, if you thought of this or that or the other thing," they just say,
Mhm.
"Yes, sir." And that has gotten Trump into trouble. It's not good for the country. He doesn't seem to
Mhm.
realize that.
So who is Trump really listening to now, if I could ask that?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know that there's a good answer. I think we've just seen, of course, the tragic death of Senator Lindsey Graham. I do think
Yeah.
that he had Trump's ear, particularly on the issues of Iran and Ukraine. I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio is within the administration probably the single most important voice, but it depends from issue to issue. He's very strong on Cuba and Venezuela. And yet, in the case of Ukraine and Iran, you have Vice President Vance and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff
Mhm.
doing the negotiations. So it's unclear, and there's no systematic process in the second
Mhm.
Trump term to make decisions. In all other administrations, you have the National Security Council to do
Mhm.
that to help the president. But even in the first term, Trump had trouble with that discipline of thinking things through and hearing different points of view. So with the NSC mechanism now not functioning, it's in many cases whoever talked to Trump last.
How they talk about Israel being a very big influence in beginning of this war or starting of this war. What is your take on that? How much of an influence do you think Mr. Netanyahu played in this entire thing?
If you go back to the first term, obviously Iran was a major issue because of
Yeah.
its nuclear weapons program. Trump withdrew from the 2015 Obama nuclear deal. I think that was clearly the right thing to do. But then we still had to decide, okay, so what comes next if we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons? And my position, as it has been for decades now, is that the only way to lasting peace and security in the Middle East is to change the regime in Tehran. You're simply not going to have any prospect for real security and peace as long as the nuclear program continues, the terrorist program continues in the region and around the world. That was also essentially Netanyahu's view. And so he made his views known to Trump. But notwithstanding these efforts, Trump never accepted the idea of regime change as a U.S. policy objective. And
Mhm.
I don't know what Netanyahu would have said to him in the second term that was any different than what he was saying in the first term when he
Mhm.
didn't succeed in convincing Trump that regime change
Mhm.
was necessary. So there's some new factor in there that accounted for Trump taking military action in February, and in
Mhm.
fact taking action against the Iran nuclear program in June of 2025.
Mhm.
I think the steps were correct, but it's hard to say really what caused Trump to change his mind.
Mhm. Trump keeps threatening about, withdrawing from NATO. That's one of the things that has been going around for quite some time now. You worked for him. Do you think he's doing it to take leverage, or does he actually mean, that US is going to withdraw from NATO?
Well, he's never been much of a supporter of NATO. He came very close, actually, to withdrawing at the 2018 NATO summit.
Hmm.
Uh, but he goes back and forth. He basically doesn't understand the alliance. He thinks it's a scam, that the Europeans get the benefit of American protection but don't pay for it, and we don't get anything out of it. That's not really how NATO functions. He just finished the 2026 NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey. It turned out better than a lot of people expected, but I don't think Trump has fundamentally changed his mind. I think in 2027, if they have a summit in 2027, that could be just as much of a crisis as it has been in prior years. And this is part of the problem with Trump. He's not consistent. He doesn't have an overall strategy. He changes his mind quite regularly, and people have trouble keeping up with him. Is he pro-NATO today, or is he negative on NATO today? And that's really hardly the way to conduct an alliance.
I mean, I feel, if America pulls back from NATO, who deters Russia then? One of the key questions that is there. And
well, I think Russia would definitely take advantage of a U.S. withdrawal from NATO, or even a substantial reduction in our participation in the alliance, and I think that would endanger the Europeans primarily. And that's why I think they understand that. That's why they're trying to spend more on defense, trying to convince Trump to help out in Ukraine, where we've already obviously seen Russian aggression back in 2022, and otherwise keep Trump involved. So I think they feel relatively happy after the Ankara summit. But I think it's important to understand that just tells you where Trump was in the days he was at the summit in Turkey. It doesn't tell you where he is today, for example.
One other question that I have is, what's behind the US's change strategy in Ukraine? Is Trump not honoring the spirit of anchorage, as often quoted by Kremlin?
This is a point where he seems to be more inclined to help Ukraine out than he has been before. In Ankara, he did say he would license the technology of the Patriot anti-missile systems, which Ukraine has been asking for, to allow Ukraine to produce them on their own. But that's something that will only come after a couple of years. You can't just snap your fingers and expect the production to begin overnight. But it was a plus for Ukraine, and I think a signal to Moscow. They've been having difficulty on the battlefield. Ukraine has demonstrated real expertise in drone technology, counter-drone technology, and now we're seeing reports not just in aerial drones, but drones on the ground too. So Ukraine has really put a lot of effort into its own defense, and Trump seems inclined to allow that to keep going. So that's one of many reasons why Europeans thought the NATO summit came out so well.
Mr. Bolton, how Mr. Trump always, says we bombed this, we bombed that, and then how he's, in a sort of a hurry to declare the victory. So my question here is this war with Iran, about American security, or is it, Mr. Trump needing to win something, there, or is he taking it too personal now?
I think there are critical U.S. security interests involved in Iran. It is pursuing nuclear weapons. It has terrorist groups across the Middle East. It has conducted terrorist activities in Europe and in the United States. It's threatened current and former U.S. office holders, myself included. So it's a very serious problem. It's also repressing its own people, and the economic situation in Iran is very, very grave at the moment. So I think there are important issues to address. What's Trump focused on? Trump's focused on the November congressional midterm elections. That's why he wanted the price of oil to come down. That's the single most important point of focus for him up until the elections in November.
What are your views on the midterms? What do you feel, as we see the ratings are dipping, with each passing day? What's your take on that?
Well, Trump's personal approval ratings continue to go down. I mean, sometimes they're up, but then they're down more. The overall trend is clearly down. I think it's looks very difficult for Republicans in the House of Representatives. I think most observers would say the Democrats are likely to take control. The Senate is more uncertain. And I think there's at least a chance Republicans can keep control, but it's still 4 months until the election, so there's a lot can happen in that period.
The war that has started, for the benefit of America. So, do you really think the Americans are, getting the benefit of the whole soul of the war? And
So I don't think they're seeing the benefits so much. Gas prices did come down a bit. That's
yeah,
why inflation was down. But at least as of the time we're speaking, it looks like prices are going to go up again. So this is part of Trump's problem. He tries to solve one issue, but it doesn't work in the form of the memorandum of understanding. Now he's gone back to it's not full scale war, but certainly the resumption of military activities. That means gasoline prices are going
yeah,
to rise again. And it's entirely possible we'll just see this gridlock for the next 4 months. I don't think that bodes well. People are worried about prices. They're worried about the economy, even though overall the economy continues to grow at a very impressive rate. People are still nervous about their own personal situation, and that's always a problem for the party in power when the electorate confronts that.
Mr. Bolton, talking about the tariffs and be it charging 20% in the hormuz fee, and or sanctioning Russia oils. In terms of India, the relationships have gone from being the best of friends to being colleague sort of a thing. What's your take on that? How
Well, I think it's critical for the U.S. to have a good strategic relationship with India. We face many of the same common problems in the form of China in particular.
yeah,
Obviously, India is directly affected by how much oil gets exported from the Gulf. And so Trump's efforts to open the Strait of Hormuz, to deny the regime in Tehran the ability to close it, is critical for India and many other countries too. That's why I don't think Trump's ultimately going to impose a 20% price
mhm,
for having shipping come through. If oil's at $75 a barrel and he adds 20%, that would put it up to $90 a barrel, which is not going to bring
yeah,
price of gasoline down in the United States. So I think this is Trump. He had an idea, so he says it. Tomorrow he'll have another idea.
yeah.
That's what happens.
Done. Thank you, Mr. Bolton, for speaking to Times Network. It was lovely speaking to you.
Well, thanks very much for having me.